The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood before the ornate mirror in her private chambers. Her reflection showed a woman who had grown from a shy university student into one of the most photographed people in the world. Today was different, though. Today carried a weight that pressed against her chest like a stone. William entered the room quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet that had witnessed countless royal moments throughout the centuries. He watched his wife adjust her pearl earrings, the same ones his mother Diana had worn to so many public engagements. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Catherine now carried forward traditions that Diana had helped reshape. "The car will be here in 20 minutes, William said softly, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when duty called, but his heart wished otherwise. Catherine nodded without turning around, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Through the window she could see the press gathering like storm clouds, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every moment of what would become a defining day in their lives. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a courier whose somber expression had told them everything they needed to know before the envelope was even opened. Her Majesty's private secretary had written in his careful script that the Queen wished to see them both alone in her private study. Such requests were never casual, never simple family visits. They carried the weight of centuries and the burden of decisions that would echo through history. Catherine finally turned to face her husband, and in his eyes she saw the same mixture of duty and sorrow that she felt. They had known this day would come eventually. From the moment William had placed his mother's engagement ring on her finger all those years ago, they had understood that their love story was not entirely their own. It belonged to the nation, to the Commonwealth, to history itself. The young woman who had once been Catherine Middleton, who had met Prince William at St. Andrews University over a shared love of art history and late-night conversations, felt like a lifetime ago. She remembered their first meeting at a charity fashion show, where she had walked down a runway in a sheer dress that had caught his attention. How different everything had seemed then, when their biggest worry was passing exams and finding time to be together despite his royal duties. Now, as the Princess of Wales, she carried the hopes and expectations of millions. Every outfit choice was analyzed, every public appearance scrutinized, every gesture interpreted for hidden meanings. She had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of royal protocol while maintaining her own sense of self, but some days the weight of it all felt overwhelming. William approached her slowly, reaching out to straighten a strand of her hair that had fallen out of place. His touch was gentle, familiar, carrying with it all the unspoken understanding that had grown between them over their years together. They had weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser relationships, faced challenges that had tested not just their love, but their very understanding of who they were meant to be. The sound of vehicles arriving in the courtyard below broke the silence. Catherine could hear the distinctive rumble of the royal protection officers' cars, followed by the softer purr of their official vehicle. Soon they would be whisked away to Buckingham Palace, where the Queen waited with news that would change everything. She thought about their children safely at school, unaware that their parents were about to receive information that would reshape their understanding of their own futures. George, Charlotte, and Louis had grown up knowing they were different, that their lives would never be entirely normal, but they still laughed and played and argued like any other children. Catherine had fought hard to give them as much normalcy as possible, understanding from her own childhood how precious those carefree moments could be. The weight of tradition pressed down on her shoulders as she reached for her handbag, checking once more that she had everything she needed. Inside were the usual items any woman might carry, but also the small notebook where she jotted down thoughts and observations about her royal duties. She had learned early on that memory alone wasn't enough when every word might be quoted and every action might set precedent. William offered her his arm, a gesture both formal and intimate that had become second nature to them over the years. As they walked together toward the door, Catherine felt the familiar transformation that occurred whenever they stepped into their public roles. The private woman who worried about her children's homework and argued with her husband about whose turn it was to walk the dog became the composed, graceful Princess of Wales that the world expected to see. Their footsteps echoed in the corridor as they made their way toward the entrance where their car waited. Portrait after portrait of previous generations looked down at them from gilded frames, silent witnesses to the passage of time and the continuity of duty that defined royal life. Catherine often wondered what those long-dead monarchs and consorts would think of the modern world their successors now navigated. The heavy doors opened before them, and immediately the sound of cameras clicking filled the air like mechanical rain. Catherine's smile appeared automatically, that perfect blend of warmth and reserve that she had perfected over years of public appearances. Beside her, William's hand found the small of her back, a protective gesture that spoke of partnership and support. As they approached their vehicle, Catherine caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface of the car door. The woman looking back at her was poised, elegant, every inch the future queen consort, but behind her eyes was the knowledge that in just a few hours, everything they thought they knew about their future might change forever. The goodbye they were about to witness would indeed be etched in history, captured not just by the cameras surrounding them, but in the hearts of a nation that had learned to love them both. The journey to Buckingham Palace felt both endless and far too short. Catherine watched the familiar streets of London pass by through the tinted windows, each landmark carrying memories of public engagements, celebrations, and moments that had shaped their royal journey. The crowds were smaller today, just the usual tourists and Londoners going about their daily business, unaware of the significance of this particular car journey. William sat beside her in contemplative silence, occasionally checking his phone for messages that couldn't wait. Catherine knew he was thinking about the same thing she was, wondering what news awaited them in his grandmother's private study. The Queen had always been a pillar of strength in their lives, offering guidance when they needed it most and allowing them space to grow into their roles at their own pace. The car turned through the gates of Buckingham Palace, and Catherine felt the familiar flutter of nerves that still accompanied visits to this most formal of royal residences. Despite years of experience, the sheer weight of history contained within these walls never failed to impress her. Every room held stories of triumph and tragedy, of decisions that had shaped not just Britain but the entire world. Their protection officer opened the car door, and they stepped out into the private courtyard. The bustle of tourists and press was left behind at the gates, replaced by the quiet efficiency of palace staff who moved about their duties with practiced discretion. Catherine smoothed her skirt and checked her appearance once more, knowing that even here in what was supposed to be privacy, there would be staff members whose discretion could never be completely guaranteed. They were met by the Queen's private secretary, a man whose poker face revealed nothing about the nature of their summons. His greeting was formal but warm, the kind of professional courtesy that palace staff had perfected over decades of service. He led them through corridors lined with priceless artwork, past rooms where treaties had been signed and where heads of state had been entertained. Catherine's heels clicked against the polished marble floors as they walked, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged passages. She thought about all the women who had walked these same corridors before her, carrying their own burdens of duty and expectation. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, and of course Diana, whose memory still cast both shadow and light over everything the royal family did. The private study was smaller than many people might imagine, decorated with personal photographs and mementos that spoke of a life lived in service, but also of a grandmother who delighted in her children and grandchildren. The Queen rose from behind her desk as they entered, her movement still graceful despite her advanced age. She had always possessed a natural dignity that seemed to fill whatever room she occupied. "William, Catherine," she said, her voice carrying that distinctive tone that millions around the world would recognize. "Please sit down." She gestured toward the comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace, away from the formality of her desk. This was to be a family conversation, not an official audience. Catherine settled into her chair, noting the way the Queen's eyes seemed to take in every detail of their appearance and demeanor. It was a skill honed over decades of reading people, of understanding the unspoken concerns and worries that people brought into her presence. The Queen had always been remarkably perceptive, able to sense the mood and needs of those around her. William leaned forward slightly, his body language showing the respect and attention he had always given his grandmother. From childhood, he had understood that she was not just his grandmother but the embodiment of an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years. Yet she had also been the one to comfort him after his mother's death, to guide him through the challenges of growing up in the public eye. "I wanted to speak with you both personally," the Queen began, her hands folded in her lap. "There are decisions that must be made, transitions that must be planned." She paused, and in that pause Catherine felt the weight of unspoken words, of changes that would ripple through their lives and the lives of millions of people who looked to the monarchy for stability and continuity. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast patterns on the carpet, highlighting the rich colors of the Persian rug that had been a gift from a long-ago state visit. Catherine found herself focusing on these small details, using them to anchor herself as the Queen continued to speak about matters that would reshape their understanding of their own futures. "The doctors have been very clear about their prognosis," the Queen said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "I wanted you to hear this from me before any official announcements are made." Catherine felt William's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining in a gesture of mutual support that had become instinctive over their years together. The Queen spoke about duty and service, about the importance of ensuring smooth transitions and maintaining public confidence in the institution of monarchy. She talked about the Commonwealth, about the relationships that had been built over decades and that would need to be carefully maintained. But underneath her formal words, Catherine could hear the voice of a grandmother who was concerned about the burdens she was about to place on the shoulders of those she loved. Catherine listened with growing understanding of what this conversation really meant. The Queen was not just sharing medical news. She was beginning the process of transferring responsibility, of ensuring that the monarchy would continue to serve its people with the same dedication and dignity that had characterized her own remarkable reign. The room seemed to grow smaller as the implications of their conversation began to sink in. Catherine thought about the children again, about how their lives would change, about the increased scrutiny and responsibility that would come with their new roles. She thought about the British people, who had known no other monarch for most of their lives, and about how they would cope with such a momentous change. As the Queen continued to outline her plans and expectations, Catherine realized that this was the beginning of goodbye, not just to one phase of their lives but to the world as they had known it. The embrace that would soon capture the heart of a nation was still to come, but already she could feel the emotional weight of what lay ahead, settling around them like a mantle they would carry for the rest of their lives. The silence that followed the Queen's words seemed to stretch for an eternity, though in reality it lasted only moments. Catherine felt as though the world had shifted slightly off its axis, leaving her struggling to find her bearings in this new reality. Beside her, William's breathing had become deeper, more measured, the way it always did when he was processing information that would require difficult decisions. "How long?" William asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The Queen met his gaze directly, her expression gentle but unflinching. She had always believed in facing difficult truths head-on, in dealing with reality rather than comfortable illusions. "The doctors say perhaps 6 months, possibly less," she replied, "but I wanted to use whatever time remains to ensure everything is properly arranged. The transition must be seamless for the sake of stability." Catherine watched as William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a telltale sign of the emotion he was working to control. Catherine found herself thinking about their last family gathering, just a few weeks ago at Balmoral. The Queen had seemed tired but otherwise well, playing with the great-grandchildren and enjoying the late summer sunshine in the gardens she loved so much. There had been no hint of the devastating news she was now sharing with them. "What about Charles?" Catherine asked, referring to William's father, who, as heir apparent, should be the first to know about such momentous developments. The Queen's expression grew even more serious, if that were possible. "Your father has already been informed," she told William. "We had this conversation yesterday. He understands the situation and supports the decisions we discussed." There was something in her tone that suggested those conversations had not been easy ones, that even within the royal family, the implications of what was to come were causing strain and difficult emotions. Catherine realized that the Queen was not just sharing medical news, but was essentially announcing the beginning of the end of the Elizabethan era, a period of British history that had spanned more than 7 decades. The woman sitting across from them had been queen when their parents were children, had presided over the transformation of Britain from an empire to a modern nation, had guided the monarchy through scandals and triumphs that would have destroyed lesser institutions. "I want you both to understand," the Queen continued, "that this is not just about succession planning. This is about ensuring that the values and principles that have guided this monarchy continue into the future. The British people, and indeed people throughout the Commonwealth, will need stability and reassurance during this transition." William straightened in his chair, and Catherine could see him mentally shifting gears, moving from grandson to future king. It was a transformation she had witnessed many times over the years, the way he could separate his personal feelings from his public duties when circumstances demanded it. But this was different, more final, more absolute than anything they had faced before. "What do you need from us?" he asked, his voice stronger now, more certain. The Queen smiled then, an expression of pride and sadness mixed together. "I need you to be ready," she said simply. "Both of you. The coming months will be difficult, and the years that follow will be even more challenging. But I have watched you both grow into your roles, and I have complete confidence in your ability to serve our people with dignity and compassion." Catherine felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill over despite her efforts to maintain composure. This was not just a conversation about royal duties and constitutional requirements. This was a grandmother saying goodbye to grandchildren she loved, even as she prepared them to carry forward responsibilities that would define the rest of their lives. The Queen reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages worn from years of use. "This contains my thoughts about the challenges you will face, lessons I have learned that might be helpful to you. But remember, each monarch must find their own way of serving. The monarchy must evolve to remain relevant, while never losing sight of its essential purpose." Catherine accepted the journal with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that she was receiving not just advice but a piece of history. The pages would contain insights born of decades of experience, wisdom gained through triumph and tragedy, guidance that money could not buy, and that few people in the world would ever be privileged to receive. "Will there be a formal announcement?" William asked, his mind already working through the practical implications of what they had learned. The Queen nodded, her expression becoming more businesslike. "In due course. But first, there are arrangements to be made, conversations to be had with the Prime Minister and other Commonwealth leaders. The public will be informed when the time is right, in a way that provides reassurance and stability." Catherine understood that even the timing of such announcements was a matter of national importance, requiring careful coordination with government officials and constitutional experts. As they continued to talk through the practical details, Catherine found herself studying the Queen's face, trying to memorize every line and expression. This woman had been a constant presence in British life for so long that many people could not imagine the world without her. She had been there during the rebuilding after World War II, through the social revolutions of the 1960s, through economic crises and national celebrations that had shaped modern Britain. The weight of following in such footsteps felt overwhelming, but Catherine drew strength from William's steady presence beside her, and from the confidence the Queen was showing in their ability to meet the challenges ahead. They had been preparing for this responsibility their entire married life, but knowing it was coming and actually facing it were very different things. As their meeting drew to a close, the Queen stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the gardens where tourists continued their sightseeing, unaware of the historic conversation taking place just meters away. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and Catherine realized that they were watching the end of one era and the beginning of another, marked not by grand ceremonies but by quiet words spoken in a private room where history was being made. The weeks that followed their private meeting with the Queen passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated activities and behind-the-scenes preparations. To the outside world, everything appeared normal. William and Catherine continued their public engagements, attended state functions, and carried out their royal duties with their usual grace and professionalism. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Catherine found herself paying closer attention to every detail of their public appearances, studying how the Queen conducted herself during official ceremonies, watching how she interacted with dignitaries and members of the public. Every gesture, every word, every decision was now viewed through the lens of future responsibility. She was no longer just learning to be the Princess of Wales. She was preparing to become Queen Consort. The children had begun to notice subtle changes in their parents' behavior, though William and Catherine had decided to wait before sharing the full truth with them. George, at 10 years old, was old enough to understand some of the implications, but Charlotte and Louis were still too young to fully comprehend what their great-grandmother's illness would mean for their family's future. One evening, as Catherine was reading bedtime stories to Louis, he looked up at her with those wide blue eyes that reminded her so much of William at that age. "Mummy, why do you and Papa seem sad lately?" he asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. Catherine's heart ached as she searched for words that would be honest but not frightening. "Sometimes grown-ups have to think about important things that make them feel serious," she said carefully, stroking his hair. "But we're not sad when we're with you. You and George and Charlotte make us very happy." It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The truth was too big, too overwhelming for a 6-year-old to carry. During this time, Catherine noticed that William was spending more time in his father's company. Charles had been preparing for kingship his entire life, and now that preparation was entering its final phase. The conversations between father and son were private, conducted in studies and drawing rooms away from staff and family members, but Catherine could see the weight of them in William's expression when he returned home each evening. One afternoon, while William was meeting with constitutional lawyers about the legal aspects of succession, Catherine received an unexpected phone call. It was the Queen's private secretary, asking if she might join Her Majesty for tea. Such informal invitations were rare, and Catherine understood that this was likely to be another significant conversation. She arrived at Buckingham Palace to find the Queen in her private sitting room, a cozy space filled with family photographs and personal mementos that spoke of a life lived both in public service and private affection. The Queen looked frailer than she had just weeks before, but her mind remained sharp and her manner as composed as ever. "I wanted to speak with you alone," the Queen said, as they settled into comfortable chairs with their tea. "About the unique challenges you will face as Queen Consort." Catherine felt a flutter of nervousness, understanding that this conversation would be different from the formal guidance she had received over the years about her role as Princess of Wales. The Queen spoke about the loneliness that could come with the position, the way that being married to the king would set her apart even from those closest to her. She talked about the importance of maintaining her own identity while supporting her husband's role, about the delicate balance between being visible enough to serve the public effectively while never overshadowing the monarch himself. Diana struggled with these contradictions, the Queen said quietly, and Catherine realized this was the first time she had heard the Queen speak so directly about William's mother. She had tremendous gifts, a natural ability to connect with people that was truly remarkable, but she found it difficult to accept the constraints that come with the role. Catherine listened carefully, understanding that these words carried decades of experience and hard-won wisdom. The Queen was sharing insights that could only come from someone who had lived through the challenges of royal marriage and understood the particular pressures that came with being the wife of a future king. "You have shown remarkable strength and adaptability," the Queen continued, "but the pressures will intensify significantly when William becomes king. The public will expect more of you, the media attention will be more intense, and the constitutional requirements will be more demanding. You must be prepared for that." They talked about the practical aspects of the role, about the ceremonial duties and the constitutional requirements that would define Catherine's future life. But more importantly, they talked about the emotional and psychological challenges, about how to maintain a sense of self when so much of life becomes about serving others and representing an institution that is bigger than any individual. The Queen shared stories about her own early years as a young mother trying to balance family life with royal duties, about the mistakes she had made and the lessons she had learned. Catherine was struck by the vulnerability in these admissions, the way this famously private woman was opening herself up to provide guidance and support. "The most important thing to remember," the Queen said as their conversation drew to a close, "is that the monarchy exists to serve the people, not the other way around. Everything we do, every decision we make must be guided by that principle. Personal desires and preferences must always be secondary to the greater good." As Catherine prepared to leave, the Queen walked with her to the door, moving more slowly than she once had but maintaining the dignity that had defined her entire life. At the threshold, she placed a gentle hand on Catherine's arm. "You will face criticism," she said quietly. "There will be times when you question whether you are strong enough for this role, whether you are worthy of the trust the British people place in you. But I have watched you for many years now, and I know that you have the strength, the wisdom, and the compassion necessary to serve with distinction." The embrace they shared then was brief but meaningful, a moment of connection between two women who understood the unique burdens and privileges that came with their roles in the royal family. As Catherine left the palace that day, she carried with her not just advice and guidance, but the knowledge that she had the Queen's complete confidence and support as she prepared to step into a role that would define the rest of her life. That evening, as she shared the details of her conversation with William, Catherine realized that they were no longer just preparing for some distant future responsibility. They were actively transitioning into their new roles, learning to carry the weight of expectation and duty that would soon be theirs to bear. The goodbye that would capture the nation's heart was drawing closer, and with it the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another. The phone call came at dawn on a Tuesday morning in early November. William answered immediately, having learned to sleep lightly in recent weeks as the Queen's condition had gradually worsened. Catherine was awake instantly, reading the gravity of the situation in her husband's face as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. "We'll be there within the hour," William said quietly, before hanging up. He turned to Catherine, and she saw in his eyes the same mixture of grief and resolve that she had witnessed when he spoke about his mother's death. "It's time," he said simply. They dressed quickly and in silence, both understanding the significance of what lay ahead. This would likely be their final private moment with the Queen, the last opportunity to say goodbye before the constitutional machinery of succession began its inexorable process. Catherine chose a simple black dress and minimal jewelry, knowing that every choice she made from this moment forward would be scrutinized and analyzed by historians for decades to come. The drive to Windsor Castle took place in the gray half-light of early morning, with only essential security personnel aware of the urgency of their journey. Catherine watched the countryside pass by, thinking about all the times she had made this journey for happier occasions, family gatherings, celebrations, quiet Sunday lunches where the Queen delighted in watching her great-grandchildren play in the gardens. They were met at the castle by a small group of senior staff members whose solemn expressions confirmed what they already knew. The Queen's doctor briefed them quietly as they walked through the familiar corridors, explaining that while Her Majesty was comfortable, the end was likely to come within hours rather than days. Charles was already there, having arrived the night before when it became clear that this was the beginning of the final farewell. He embraced his son wordlessly, and Catherine was struck by how the formal structures of royal protocol seemed to fall away in the face of genuine human grief. This was not the heir apparent and the future king, but simply a father and son facing the loss of someone they loved. Anne, Andrew, and Edward had also been summoned, along with key members of the household staff who had served the Queen for decades. The castle felt hushed, as though even the ancient stones understood the magnitude of what was taking place within their walls. Staff members moved quietly through the corridors, their usual efficiency tempered by the emotional weight of the day. Catherine and William were shown to the Queen's private sitting room, where she was resting in her favorite chair by the window that overlooked the gardens she had loved so much. Even in her weakened state, she maintained the dignity and composure that had defined her entire life. Her eyes lit up when she saw them, and Catherine was reminded once again of how this woman who had been a symbol of stability for so many was also a beloved grandmother. "I'm so glad you're here," the Queen said, her voice soft but clear. William knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his, and Catherine saw the young boy he had once been, seeking comfort and guidance from the woman who had helped raise him after his mother's death. They spoke quietly about family matters, about the children's progress in school, about small, ordinary things that seemed precious precisely because they were ordinary. The Queen asked about George's rugby matches and Charlotte's piano lessons, showing the same interest in her great-grandchildren's lives that she had always demonstrated, even as her own life was drawing to a close. As the morning progressed, other family members came and went, each having their own private moments with the Queen. Catherine was struck by how she managed to give each person her full attention, to make each conversation feel special and meaningful despite her obvious fatigue. It was a final demonstration of the grace and consideration that had characterized her entire reign. The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived in the early afternoon, and Catherine understood that the Queen was making her final spiritual preparations. The service was private and brief but deeply moving, emphasizing themes of service, duty, and faith that had guided the Queen's life and reign. It was as the sun began to set that the moment Catherine would never forget occurred. The Queen had been resting quietly, surrounded by her closest family members, when she suddenly asked to speak with William and Catherine alone. The others withdrew respectfully, leaving the three of them in the golden light of the setting sun. "I want you to know," the Queen said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, "how proud I am of what you have both become. You have shown such dedication to duty, such love for each other and for this country. The monarchy will be in good hands." William's composure finally cracked and tears began to flow down his cheeks. The Queen reached up to touch his face, a gesture so tender and maternal that Catherine felt her own tears beginning to fall. This was not the formal monarch speaking to her heir, but a grandmother offering comfort and love to a grandson she had watched grow from a wounded boy into a man worthy of kingship. "Take care of each other," she continued, looking between them. "The years ahead will test you in ways you cannot imagine, but remember that you have each other, and you have the love and support of the British people. Never forget that this role is a privilege, not a burden." It was then that Catherine found herself moving forward, kneeling beside William, taking the Queen's other hand in hers. The three of them formed a small circle in the fading light, 3 generations of the royal family connected by love, duty, and an understanding of the weight of the responsibility they carried. The Queen looked at Catherine with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of her 96 years. "You will be a wonderful Queen consort," she said quietly. "Trust yourself, trust your instincts, and never be afraid to show compassion. The British people need to see that their royal family understands their struggles and shares their hopes." As the evening deepened, the Queen's breathing became more labored, and the family gathered once more around her bedside. She passed peacefully just after 8 o'clock, with her children and grandchildren holding her hands, and speaking words of love and gratitude for the remarkable life she had lived and the legacy she was leaving behind. The moment of her death was marked not by drama or ceremony but by profound silence, as though the entire world was pausing to acknowledge the end of an era. Catherine looked around the room at the faces of those who had loved and served this remarkable woman, understanding that they had all been privileged to witness the conclusion of one of the most extraordinary reigns in British history. In the hours that followed, as the ancient protocols of royal death began to unfold, Catherine reflected on the final conversations she had shared with the Queen, storing every word and gesture in her memory as treasures to be cherished in the challenging years ahead. The hours immediately following the Queen's death passed in a strange mixture of profound grief and carefully orchestrated protocol. Catherine found herself moving through a world that had fundamentally changed, even though everything around her looked exactly the same. The ancient mechanisms of constitutional monarchy had clicked into motion the moment the Queen drew her last breath, transforming Charles from heir apparent to King Charles III in an instant. While the new king met with senior officials to handle the immediate constitutional requirements, Catherine and William returned to their home to face one of the most difficult conversations of their lives. The children needed to be told what had happened, and they needed to understand how their great-grandmother's death would change their own lives forever. George, Charlotte, and Louis were waiting in the sitting room when their parents arrived home, having been collected from school by their security detail, with no explanation other than that they were needed at home urgently. Charlotte took one look at her mother's red-rimmed eyes and immediately asked, "Mommy, what's wrong? Why do you look so sad?" William sat down heavily in his favorite chair, gesturing for the children to come close. Catherine watched as he struggled to find words that would be appropriate for their different ages, knowing that this conversation would be remembered by all 3 children for the rest of their lives. "Great-Granny has died," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "She was very old and very tired, and she died peacefully surrounded by people who loved her very much." The immediate reaction was exactly what they had expected. Louis at 6 didn't fully understand what death meant but began crying because his parents were upset. Charlotte asked practical questions about where the Queen had gone, and whether they would see her again. George, old enough to understand the finality of death, sat quietly absorbing the information and its implications. It was Charlotte who asked the question that cut straight to the heart of their new reality. "Does this mean Papa is going to be king now?" When William nodded, she continued with the logical precision that had always characterized her thinking. "And that means you'll be queen, Mummy, and George will be heir to the throne?" Catherine felt the weight of that word heir settle around her eldest son's shoulders like an invisible crown. George looked up at his father with eyes that seemed older than his 10 years, and she realized that childhood as they had known it was effectively over for all three children. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral preparations, constitutional formalities, and media attention unlike anything they had experienced before. The Queen's death dominated every news channel, every newspaper, every conversation throughout Britain and the Commonwealth. The outpouring of grief was extraordinary, with people queuing for hours to sign books of condolence and leaving flowers outside royal residences throughout the country. Catherine found herself studying footage of previous royal funerals, understanding that every detail of her behavior during the upcoming ceremonies would be analyzed and remembered. She would be walking behind the Queen's coffin not just as a grieving granddaughter-in-law, but as the future Queen consort, representing continuity and stability at a moment when the nation needed both desperately. The funeral preparations revealed the incredible complexity of royal ceremonial. With every element planned down to the smallest detail, Catherine learned about the significance of different military honors, the protocol for seating arrangements that reflected constitutional hierarchies, and the symbolic importance of every flower chosen for the wreaths. She was fitted for mourning clothes that would be seen by billions of people around the world, understanding that even her choice of jewelry would be interpreted for hidden meanings. During one particularly difficult fitting session, as seamstresses made final adjustments to her black coat, Catherine caught sight of herself in the mirror and was startled by what she saw. The woman looking back at her carried herself differently than she had just a week before. Her posture was more formal, her expression more guarded, her entire demeanor reflecting the new responsibilities she was already beginning to carry. William was dealing with his own transformation, attending meetings with the new king about the transition of duties and responsibilities. The Prince of Wales title would pass to him formally after the funeral, along with the Duchy of Cornwall and all the responsibilities that came with being heir apparent. Catherine watched her husband grapple with becoming one step closer to kingship, seeing how the weight of future responsibility was changing him in subtle but unmistakable ways. The children were struggling with their own adjustments. George had become quieter, more serious, asking thoughtful questions about royal duty and what would be expected of him in the future. Charlotte was processing her grief through art, drawing pictures of her great-grandmother surrounded by her beloved corgis. Louis, still too young to fully understand the permanence of death, kept asking when great-granny would be coming back from heaven. 3 days before the funeral, Catherine received an unexpected invitation. The new king asked if she would join him for a private conversation in his study at Clarence House. She arrived to find Charles looking older than she had ever seen him, the weight of kingship already visible in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he held himself. "I wanted to speak with you about the years ahead," he said without preamble, "about what will be expected of you as William prepares for kingship." Catherine realized this was the first of what would be many conversations about her evolving role, about how she would need to adapt and grow to meet the challenges of supporting a future king. Charles spoke candidly about the pressures she would face, about the way media attention would intensify and public expectations would increase. He talked about the importance of finding trusted advisors, about learning to balance public duty with family life, about the sacrifice of privacy that came with increased responsibility. "Your role will be different from your mother-in-law's," he said, referring to Diana with a directness that surprised Catherine. "The monarchy has evolved and public expectations have changed, but the fundamental requirement remains the same: absolute dedication to duty above personal preference." They discussed practical matters like security arrangements for the children, educational decisions that would need to be made with their future roles in mind, and the careful balance between allowing them normal childhood experiences while preparing them for lives of public service. As their conversation continued, Catherine found herself thinking about the Queen's final words to her, about trusting her instincts and showing compassion. She realized that the funeral would mark not just the end of the Queen's remarkable reign, but the beginning of a new chapter for the entire royal family, one in which she would play an increasingly central role. The night before the funeral, Catherine lay awake thinking about the moment that was approaching. Tomorrow, in front of billions of viewers around the world, she would say goodbye to the woman who had guided her through her transformation from commoner to princess to future queen. The embrace that would capture the heart of a nation was still to come, but already Catherine could feel the emotional weight of what lay ahead, the knowledge that she was about to participate in a moment that would be remembered and analyzed for generations to come. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and overcast, as though the very sky was mourning the loss of the woman who had been Britain's anchor for over 70 years. Catherine woke before her alarm, having spent most of the night in fitful sleep punctuated by dreams of ceremonies and crowds. Today would be unlike any other day in her life, a moment when personal grief and public duty would merge before the eyes of the world. The preparation process began hours before the ceremony, with hair and makeup artists working to create a look that would be appropriate for the solemnity of the occasion, while ensuring Catherine would appear composed under the intense scrutiny of television cameras. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed, from the angle of her hat to the precise moment when she would curtsy to the new king. William was already dressed when she entered their bedroom, standing before the mirror adjusting his military uniform with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Catherine recognized the signs of the intense emotion he was working to control, the same careful composure he had maintained during his mother's funeral all those years ago. She approached him quietly, straightening an already perfect collar in a gesture that was both practical and deeply intimate. "She would be proud of you," Catherine said softly, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "She would be proud of all of us." William nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and Catherine understood that beneath his composed exterior, he was struggling with the dual role of grieving grandson and future king, who must provide stability for the nation. The children were subdued as they prepared for the day, understanding the importance of the occasion, even if they couldn't fully comprehend its historical significance. George wore his first formal morning suit, looking heartbreakingly grown up as he practiced the solemn demeanor he would need to maintain throughout the day. Charlotte kept asking quiet questions about the ceremony, wanting to understand exactly what would happen and why. Louis, still struggling to understand why great-granny couldn't come back, held tightly to his mother's hand as they prepared to leave for Westminster Abbey. The journey to the Abbey took place in solemn convoy, with hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets despite the early hour and threatening weather. Catherine was struck by the sea of faces all turned toward their car with expressions of sympathy and support. Many people were crying openly, holding photographs of the Queen or handmade signs expressing their gratitude for her years of service. Inside Westminster Abbey, Catherine was overwhelmed by the grandeur of the setting and the weight of history contained within its ancient walls. World leaders, royal family members, and representatives from every corner of the Commonwealth filled the Gothic space, all gathered to pay their respects to a woman who had touched millions of lives through her 7 decades of service. As they took their seats in the front row, Catherine felt the eyes of the world upon her family. She knew that every expression, every gesture, every moment of emotion would be captured and analyzed by historians for generations to come. The pressure to represent not just her own grief, but the grief of a nation felt almost overwhelming. The service itself was a masterpiece of ceremonial tradition, combining the solemn beauty of Anglican liturgy with military precision and royal pageantry. Catherine found herself deeply moved by the readings and hymns that the Queen had chosen herself, understanding that even in death, she was continuing to guide and comfort those she left behind. It was during the final moments of the service, as the Queen's coffin was being prepared for its journey to Windsor Castle, that the moment occurred, which would indeed be etched in history. As the royal family stood to process out of the Abbey, Catherine found herself walking beside William, their children between them, when suddenly the weight of everything they had lost and everything they were about to inherit seemed to overwhelm them both. Without conscious thought, Catherine reached for William's hand, and he immediately clasped hers in return. It was a simple gesture, natural between husband and wife, but in that moment it represented so much more. It was a moment of human connection in the midst of ancient ceremony, A reminder that beneath the titles and traditions were two people who loved each other and were facing an uncertain future together. The embrace came moments later, as they paused at the Abbey's entrance before the waiting crowds. William turned to Catherine, and without regard for protocol or the watching cameras, he pulled her into his arms. It was not a formal gesture or a calculated photo opportunity, but a spontaneous expression of love and mutual support in a moment of profound grief and transition. The embrace lasted only seconds, but the photographs captured something that touched the hearts of people around the world. Here were the future king and queen, showing vulnerability and humanity even as they prepared to take on roles that would require them to sacrifice much of their private lives for public service. The image spoke to the enduring power of love and partnership in the face of duty and responsibility. As they separated and continued their procession to the waiting cars, Catherine felt a shift in the air around them. The crowd's response was immediate and emotional, with many people calling out words of support and encouragement. She realized that in that unguarded moment, they had connected with the public in a way that all their carefully choreographed appearances could never achieve. The journey to Windsor for the private burial service gave Catherine time to reflect on what had just occurred. She understood that the embrace had become more than just a personal moment between husband and wife. It had become a symbol of the monarchy's ability to evolve and remain relevant, to show emotion while maintaining dignity, to be both human and royal. As they laid the Queen to rest in the small chapel at Windsor, surrounded only by family and closest friends, Catherine felt the full weight of transition settling upon them. The woman who had guided the monarchy through the modern era was gone, but her legacy lived on in the values she had instilled and the example she had set. Walking back through the grounds of Windsor Castle as the sun finally broke through the clouds, Catherine realized that the goodbye they had witnessed was indeed etched in history. But more than that, it marked the beginning of their own chapter in the continuing story of the British monarchy, a story they would write together with the same dedication, love, and commitment to service that the Queen had demonstrated throughout her remarkable life. The embrace that captured the heart of a nation had become a symbol of hope for the future, proof that even in times of great change and uncertainty, love and partnership could provide the strength needed to carry on the most important traditions while adapting to meet the challenges of a new era.